Chapter 3: A Visit to India. In late 1955, I received a formal invitation from the Crown Prince of Sikkim in his capacity as the President of the Maha Bodhi Society of India to participate in the celebrations of the 2500th anniversary of Buddha Jayanti, the birth of the Buddha. Initially, Fan Ming, a senior political officer in the People's Liberation Army stationed in Lhasa, urged me to refuse the invitation. He told me that the Crown Prince was not high enough in rank for me to be accepting such a formal invitation. So I quietly sent a message to the Indian mission in Lhasa to explain the situation, which led to the arrival of a second invitation, this time from the Vice President of India, Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan. After several months, I was told that Beijing had okayed my trip to India. Before I left, General Chiang Ching-wu warned me, "Be careful. There are many reactionary elements and spies in India. If you try to do anything with them, I want you to realize that what has happened in Hungary and Poland will happen in Tibet." He was referring to the suppression of the Poznan protests in Poland in June 1956, when tanks and troops fired on protesting civilians, and the brutal crushing of the People's Uprising in Hungary by Soviet tanks and troops on November 4th, 1956, a few weeks before my trip. Despite his warnings, I was thrilled at the chance to visit the Holy Land of India and the sites associated with the life of the Buddha. At the same time, however, I was acutely aware of the worsening situation in Tibet, especially the growing arrogance and belligerence of the Chinese authorities in Lhasa. For example, by 1956, when Chinese interpreters came to see me, they would wear pistols under their coats, unlike before. One day, I clearly saw the mouth of the gun jutting out. The situation in Lhasa also continued to deteriorate, with tension rising due to the presence of the large number of People's Liberation Army soldiers, as well as the growing number of refugees who escaped frightening conditions in eastern Tibet. In March 1956, for example, the People's Liberation Army attacked Lithang Monastery in eastern Tibet, an important foundation associated with the third Dalai Lama, bombing the monastery, killing several hundred people, and capturing its abbot. In November 1956, I was finally able to visit India. My Dharma brother, the Panchen Lama, had also been officially invited and joined me as well. My two elder brothers, Taktsa Rinpoche and Gyalo Thondup, both of whom were then living outside Tibet, met me at the border of Sikkim. The first words they said, before any kind of greeting, were, "You must not go back." Their urgency really shook me, and I knew there was good reason based on what I described earlier. I found myself in profound doubt about whether I should return after the celebration. For now, though, we continued on, flying to Delhi on November 25th to be met by Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, Vice President Radhakrishnan, and the Speaker of the Indian Parliament, M.A. Iyengar. We were then driven to the President's official residence to meet Rajendra Prasad. After this, the following morning, the first event in my program was to pay homage at Rajghat, the place where Mahatma Gandhi, perhaps the greatest being of our age, who applied India's ancient philosophy of ahimsa, non-violence, into an effective political movement for the freedom of his people from British colonial rule, was cremated. At that site, I affirmed more strongly than ever that I could never involve myself with any acts of violence. The formal celebrations of Buddha Jayanti took place in Bodh Gaya, the most sacred place for Buddhists everywhere. The Mahabodhi Stupa in Bodh Gaya marks the site where the Buddha attained enlightenment under a pipal tree, which later came to be known as the Bodhi tree. The tree that stands there today is a continuation of the very same tree, by way of a sapling brought from Sri Lanka in the 19th century. that in turn was a sapling of the original tree under which the Buddha sat, more than 2,600 years ago. How I felt when I came face to face for the first time with the sacred Bodhi tree, I described in my autobiography of 1962. Every devout Buddhist would always associate Bodh Gaya with all that is noblest and loftiest in his religious and cultural inheritance. From my very early youth, I had thought and dreamed about this visit. Now I stood in the presence of the Holy Spirit, who had attained enlightenment in this sacred place and found for all mankind the path to salvation. As I stood there, a feeling of religious fervor filled my heart and left me awestruck with the knowledge and impact of the divine power which is in all of us. In my address at the celebration, I touched upon the long history of Buddhism in India, how it came to Tibet from India, and the long historical and spiritual ties that lie at the heart of this transmission, as I highlighted earlier. I particularly emphasized the Buddha's teaching of nonviolence and how this teaching could contribute to ushering in a new era of peace in the world. I expressed my deep admiration of the adoption of Ashoka's Dharma Chakra, Wheel of Law, as the nation's symbol of India at independence, indicating the country's deep admiration of the universal values promoted by Buddhism. When the formal celebrations were over, I took the opportunity to go on a pilgrimage to other sacred sites around Bodh Gaya and Sarnath in central India, associated with the life of the Buddha, the ruins of Nalanda in Bihar, the greatest Indian Buddhist monastic university, as well as the ancient Buddhist monuments at Sanchi and Ajanta. Prime Minister Nehru accompanied me on my visit to Rajgir, a site associated with the Buddha's life and especially sacred to Mahayana Buddhism because it was where the perfection of wisdom scriptures were delivered, was particularly unforgettable. A memorial for the 7th century Chinese traveler Xuanzang was formally inaugurated at Rajgir, at which Premier Zhou Enlai was supposed to represent the People's Republic of China. In the end, Zhou could not come, so I was asked to present the check representing a gift from the Chinese government. These visits to the sacred Buddhist sites offered some of the most joyful and memorable moments, rare beams of sunlight amid the dark clouds surrounding me and my homeland. During my time in India, a number of prominent Tibetans living there came to urge me not to go back home. They expressed very strong views against the signing of the 17-point agreement. I also had important meetings with Prime Minister Nehru, who was then in his 60s and was the first Prime Minister since his country's independence. At my first meeting, I took the opportunity to explain in detail the full story of the Chinese invasion, how unprepared we were, and how hard I had tried to accommodate the communists as soon as I became aware that no one in the outside world was prepared to acknowledge our rightful claim to independence. I then told him how desperate things had become by now in eastern Tibet, following the bombing of Lithang Monastery, and that I feared that the Chinese really meant to destroy our religion and customs forever. I explained that I wanted to stay in India until we could win back our freedom by peaceful means. Nehru agreed with me that it was useless to fight against the Chinese. He was emphatic, however, that India could not support us and said that I should go back to my country and try to work with the Chinese on the basis of the 17-point agreement. When I protested that the Chinese authorities had broken my trust and that I did not believe that the agreement was workable any longer, he said he would speak personally to the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai. At one of my meetings with Nehru, he actually brought a copy of the agreement in his hand. Going through it point by point, he demonstrated how it could be the basis for a genuine model of autonomy and self-rule. Nehru reported on his own conversations with Zhou Enlai, and especially the unambiguous assurance Zhou had given him with respect to the autonomy of Tibet within the People's Republic of China. The trip to India was also the occasion for several meetings with the Chinese premier. Zhou Enlai, in his late 50s then, was full of smiles and charm, a courteous man with a swift intellect, in brief, clever, and smooth-talking. At my first meeting in November in Delhi, I told him straightforwardly of my concerns about Eastern Tibet, how the Chinese authorities were behaving, and especially of the brutal repression and murder of innocent people following the Lithang bombing. I also asked Zhou what happened during their reforms there and in northeastern Tibet, Amdo, that had forced so many thousands to flee as refugees to central Tibet. Zhou made a serious attempt to reassure me, admitting that major mistakes were made in eastern Tibet by the local cadres, and that the leaders at the top too had to accept responsibility since they should have intervened sooner. He told me that reforms in Tibet would not occur until my government thought the conditions were appropriate. I also shared with him my observation of the contrast between the Indian Parliament and the Chinese Communist People's Congress. In India, the Parliament members are free to express themselves as they really feel and criticize the government when they think necessary. In Beijing, I had observed that most of the members in the assembly barely dared to speak. Even if they did make a point, it was mostly about small corrections in wording, but nothing of substance. Zhou responded that I had only been at the first assembly in Beijing, and that things had changed immeasurably for the better at the second assembly. Zhou also took the trouble to meet with my brothers and key cabinet ministers of my government, including Ngabo, who had been forced to sign the 17-point agreement in Beijing on behalf of my government. The last time I met with Zhou in Delhi was after his return from a trip to Pakistan. On December 30th, 1956, I received a message from the Chinese embassy that Zhou was back in India and wanted to see me. I rushed to Delhi by train to find the Chinese ambassador Panzili waiting for me at the station. He insisted that I ride with him in his car. With the help of Indian protocol officials and security, we drove straight to the Chinese embassy, where I met with the ambassador, Zhou Enlai, and Marshal He Long. By the time my staff reached the embassy, I was already in the meeting, with my staff not knowing if I was inside or not, and some even wondering if I had been abducted. At some point, someone brought a warm shawl for me, saying that my staff wanted to make sure that I was not cold. Later, they told me that they were worried and wanted to let me know that they too had arrived at the Chinese embassy. I must admit, I found that meeting intimidating. 3 seasoned Chinese political and military men, a premier, a marshal, and an ambassador, surrounding one inexperienced young Tibetan monk. The fact that we were in Delhi and not Beijing made me at least feel safe. I stood firm and expressed my fear that the Communist Party might force unacceptable reforms in Tibet. By this time, it appeared that Zhou Enlai had clearly consulted with Mao Zedong, so he repeated all the reassurances he had given me earlier about dealing with the excesses of repression in eastern Tibet and about postponing reform. He conveyed to me Mao's pledge that the plan for communist reform in Tibet would be delayed at least for 6 years, and even after that, it would be up to me to decide whether or not to implement the reforms. He added that the Chinese government would not tolerate any outbreak of armed insurrection in Tibet, and stressed that I needed to return to Lhasa at the earliest possible moment. He concluded by telling me not to visit Kalimpong, an Indian town near the border of Tibet, where there was a community of Tibetans, some of whom had already fled into exile. To this last point, I told Joe that I would think about his suggestion. The morning after this meeting, Marshal He Long came to see me. He repeated Joe's advice that I return to Lhasa. He then quoted the saying, "The snow lion looks dignified if he stays in the snows, but if he descends to the plains, he would be treated like a dog." He was, of course, issuing me a serious warning. All of this added up to real pressure from many sides about whether I should go back to Tibet or remain in India. Certainly, among the Tibetan officials with me, there were conflicting views. It also appears that Beijing was trying to influence matters behind the scenes. Zhou had even dangled before Nehru the possible offer of China abiding by the boundaries determined between India and Tibet, known as the McMahon Line, if India would refuse asylum to me at the time. I realized in the end I myself would have to make the decision on whether to return to Tibet or not. There is a Tibetan saying, "Ask others for opinions, but make the decision yourself." So in my next meeting with Prime Minister Nehru, I told him that I had made up my mind to go back to Tibet for two reasons. Because you have advised me to do so, and because Zhou Enlai has given definite promises to me and my brothers. As it would prove, Nehru was sincere but idealistic in his belief about the Chinese pledges. Zhou was simply lying. In January 1957, ignoring Premier Zhou's advice, I left for Kalimpong from Calcutta. On my way back home, I stopped in Gangtok, where I was able to meet with many devout Buddhists and give formal religious teachings and blessing ceremonies, and also laid the foundation stone for the Namgyal Institute of Tibetology at the invitation of the Maharaja of Sikkim. I had planned to stop in Gangtok for only a few days. However, due to a heavy snowstorm, the Nathula Pass had become impassable, which meant I was happily stuck in Gangtok for a few extra weeks. While there, I also extended a formal invitation to Nehru to visit Lhasa. I wanted to reciprocate his generous hospitality during my stay in India, and more important, offer him an opportunity to acquire a first-hand impression of what was actually happening in Tibet. Although Nehru accepted my invitation, and the Chinese initially did not object, later they pulled back by saying that they could not guarantee Nehru's personal safety in Tibet. This was sad, for I would have benefited immensely from his counsel if he had visited Lhasa. Even though Nehru had not been able to come to the capital, he did end up putting a foot on Tibetan soil on his way to and back from Bhutan, which he visited in September 1958. He spent a night at Yadong, the very town where I had fled in 1950, when the Chinese Communist Army invaded from eastern Tibet. A high-level Tibetan delegation was sent to formally welcome the Prime Minister and his daughter Indira Gandhi when they arrived. It was during this visit to Bhutan that Nehru gave a strong assurance that it was India's wish to see Bhutan remain an independent country, with its own people choosing their own way of life and taking a path of progress according to their own will. This contrast between how Bhutan's giant neighbor India was treating it and how Tibet was being treated at that very moment by our giant neighbor to the east was, of course, too painfully striking to miss. Finally, as the weather improved and the way became open toward the end of February, we crossed the Nathula Pass and reached Tibetan soil. The farewell, especially to my immediately elder brother, Lobsang Samten, before crossing the pass, was a sad moment. Among all my siblings, he and I had been the closest since, as children, we shared the 10-week-long journey from Amdo to central Tibet. And immediately after my formal recognition as the Dalai Lama, we also went through early monastic tutorials at the same time. Lobsang Samten was not well at the time and was feeling quite weak. So I suggested we sit together quietly in the car for a while. He was crying and I was myself feeling sad. And all of this caused some delay, irritating the Chinese officials accompanying me back to Tibet.